Emily Dawson had been married for exactly 7 days when her life took an unexpected turn. That morning, she was still adjusting to the rhythm of being a newlywed late-night talks with her husband Daniel, romantic dinners and lazy mornings that blended into the afternoon. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. Then came the knock. It was firm, persistent, and far too early for a weekend. Emily dried her hands, still wet from washing the breakfast dishes, and opened the door with a half-smile. Standing there was Barbara Dawson, her mother-in-law, dressed sharply in a navy pantsuit, lips pursed, eyes calculating. Next to her stood a man Emily had never seen before, short, nervous-looking, with a leather briefcase clutched in his hand. "This is Mr. Gerald Mason," Barbara announced without waiting for a greeting. "He's a notary. We need to talk." Emily's stomach dropped. She invited them in out of politeness, her hands slightly trembling as she poured tea and offered cookies. Gerald sat awkwardly on the edge of the couch, while Barbara made herself at home, scanning the room with her usual judgmental glare. Barbara got straight to the point. "Now that you're part of the Dawson family," she said with a tight smile, "it's important that we sort out some paperwork. Gerald has prepared a simple prenuptial addendum. Nothing complicated, just a document to ensure fairness if, heaven forbid, something happens." Emily glanced at the papers. Her heart sank further. The document wasn't simple. It included a clause stating that any previously undisclosed assets would be considered joint marital property unless explicitly declared beforehand. It was a trap. If Emily said she owned nothing and signed, she could lose everything if the truth ever came out. What no one knew, not even Daniel, was that Emily had inherited 3 apartments from her grandmother, properties scattered across the city, quietly rented, generating a steady income. She had never mentioned them, not because she was hiding wealth, but because she feared exactly this: intrusion, control, and judgment. Barbara's gaze pierced through her. "So, Emily," she said, "do you own any property?" Emily smiled, calm but guarded. "Nothing serious. Just lived with my grandmother for a while before she passed." Barbara didn't believe her. But Emily wasn't going to give in, not yet. Not when her freedom was on the line. And so, she said nothing. And that silence would change everything. Long before that knock at the door, Emily had already made her decision. She wasn't going to tell anyone, not yet. Not about the apartments, not about the quiet income, and certainly not about the will. Emily's grandmother, Louise Hargrove, had been a woman of grit and resourcefulness. Raised during the Great Depression, she had survived by sewing clothes, fixing appliances, and when the economy turned, investing in small real estate deals that others overlooked. Over the years, Louise had acquired several modest properties in different corners of the city. She rented them out, maintained them herself, and never boasted about her success. But she kept meticulous records, and more importantly, she believed in planning ahead. When Emily turned 25, her grandmother took her aside and said, "I've left you something. You'll understand why later. But promise me one thing: don't tell anyone until you know who's truly in your corner." Emily hadn't fully grasped the weight of those words then. She had just finished graduate school, was working part-time in marketing, and dating Daniel, an earnest, kind-hearted physics professor with boyish charm and a quiet laugh. They were happy. They talked about moving in together, maybe getting married someday. At the time, Emily didn't think the inheritance mattered. Then her grandmother passed away. Emily met privately with the family lawyer and the notary. She learned she inherited not just 1, but 3 fully paid-off apartments, one in a quiet residential neighborhood, another in an up-and-coming district, and the crown jewel, a sleek, renovated flat overlooking Madison Park. The will was ironclad. Her name was on the deeds. The transition was smooth and silent. Her parents assumed the properties had been sold off. No one asked questions. Emily preferred it that way. She found trusted tenants for each unit, signed airtight leases, and set up a separate bank account for rental income. It wasn't flashy wealth, but it was enough to cover her future if she ever needed to walk away, take time off, or build something of her own. But more than anything, it gave her freedom. That freedom, however, became a burden the moment she said, "I do." Because from that moment on, everything she owned was now potentially theirs, hers and Daniel's. And if his family had anything to say about it, hers and theirs too. Emily loved Daniel. She truly did. But she had seen enough of Barbara to know exactly what would happen if her mother-in-law ever caught wind of the inheritance. It would no longer be a private matter. Barbara would make demands, ask for help with family investments, suggest sharing resources for the greater good. And once something was shared in Barbara's eyes, it was never returned. So Emily stayed silent. Not out of greed, but out of survival. And now, as she sat across from Barbara and the notary in her own living room, pretending to read the prenup she had no intention of signing, she reminded herself, freedom is worth protecting even if it means lying by omission. Especially when you're not sure who's really on your side. Emily thought the worst was behind her after declining to sign the documents. But in truth, it was just the beginning. Barbara didn't take rejection well. After that tense morning with the notary, she began showing up unannounced. Sometimes it was with pies. Other times it was with unsolicited advice or sharp critiques disguised as concern. "You should really declutter the hallway, Emily," she said one afternoon. "It gives off a messy first impression. And you know how important first impressions are, especially if you're thinking of having children." Emily swallowed her irritation. She wanted to scream, but instead she smiled thinly, nodded, and excused herself to the kitchen. She and Daniel were living in a spacious 2-bedroom condo gifted to them by his father. It had been in the Dawson family for years, but technically still belonged to Daniel's parents. And they still had a key. Barbara used that key liberally. More than once, Emily walked in from work to find Barbara inside, rearranging throw pillows, wiping counters, or even worse, inspecting the medicine cabinet. Daniel tried to mediate, but he was stuck in the middle. Raised to be respectful and deferential to his mother, he often brushed off her behavior with a gentle, "She means well." But Emily knew better. This wasn't about kindness or care. This was about control. Barbara was determined to mold their marriage into something that fit her image of family, traditional, obedient, and entirely dependent on her influence. Emily began to feel like a guest in her own home. There were constant comments about children when they would come, how they should be raised, what schools to consider. Barbara even offered to help name them. "I always liked the name Catherine for a girl," she mused one day over tea, completely uninvited. Emily smiled politely, but inside she was seething. All the while she stayed quiet about the apartments. Every time she considered telling Daniel she'd watch how he handled his mother, how quickly he backpedaled or apologized when she got upset, and Emily's resolve hardened. "No," she thought, "not yet. Not until I know for sure that telling him won't cost me everything." Then came the next blow. Barbara began pushing harder. Subtle hints turned into strategic guilt trips. "It's not fair that we carry all the responsibility," she said over dinner one night, referring to the family business. "Some people have it easier, inheritances, assets, you never know who's hiding what." It felt like a warning shot. Emily looked up from her plate and met Barbara's gaze. She knew. Or at least she suspected. And if Barbara really was on the scent, Emily needed to be more careful than ever. Because in Barbara's world, secrets weren't just personal. They were ammunition. The unraveling began with a single slip and offhand comment made by someone who didn't know any better. Emily had invited her cousin Rachel over for lunch one Saturday. Rachel, ever the social butterfly, had recently started working at a boutique real estate firm. They hadn't seen each other in months, and Emily thought catching up might lift her spirits. They were sipping iced tea on the balcony when Rachel spotted a familiar building in the distance. "Oh wow," she said, pointing. "Isn't that the Madison Park complex? We just did a showing in that building last week. Place has gorgeous units. One of them looked just like yours, the layout, the furniture style, even the window treatments. Funny coincidence." Emily froze. She had recently hired a staging company to update the Madison Park apartment before listing it for rent again. She hadn't told anyone, not even Daniel. The company must have used listing photos Rachel had access to. Trying to stay composed, she laughed it off. "Must be a popular design. That mid-century modern look is everywhere these days." Rachel shrugged and changed the subject, but Emily's heart pounded through the rest of the conversation. What she didn't know was that Rachel had also mentioned the building to Barbara the following week casually, over brunch. "I saw this apartment that reminded me so much of Emily's style," Rachel had said. "It was on Madison Park. Funny how taste runs in families." Barbara, of course, said nothing at the time. But later that day, she called a friend who worked in property management. Within 48 hours, she had a list of recent lease transfers and owner names in the building. And one of those names was unmistakably Emily's. The confrontation didn't come immediately. Barbara waited patient and quiet. She wanted proof. She wanted leverage. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, Emily came home to find Daniel on the couch, holding a printout. "It's a property listing," he said slowly, "with your name on it. From Madison Park. Mom showed it to me." Emily sat down. There was nowhere left to run. The secret was out. But what surprised her wasn't Barbara's involvement. It was Daniel's face, hurt, confused, but not angry. "I just need to understand," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. Because this moment, this quiet, honest moment, would decide everything. Emily looked at Daniel, heart pounding in her chest. "I didn't tell you," she began slowly, "because I needed to know if our relationship could survive without the weight of money tied to it. I needed to be sure that you loved me for me and not for what I might bring to the table." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression softening. She continued, voice trembling slightly. "I saw how your mother operates. I saw how she treats boundaries. And I was terrified, not of you but of what might happen if the wrong people knew. I wasn't ready to risk everything my grandmother gave me." Daniel set the papers aside. "I wish you'd told me. I would have understood." "Would you have?" she asked, gently but pointedly. "Because I've seen the way you try to please her, even when she crosses lines." That struck something deep. Daniel leaned back, sighing. He rubbed his forehead and looked away. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been afraid of standing up to her for most of my life. It was easier to let things slide. But this feels different." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the rain filling the room. Finally, Daniel reached for her hand. "Emily, I don't care about the apartments. I care that you felt you couldn't tell me. That breaks my heart more than anything. But I want to fix it. And I want to protect what's yours, not because it's valuable, but because it matters to you." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. They talked late into the night, really talked. About their future, about boundaries, about what it would take to truly become a team. They agreed that the apartments would remain solely in Emily's name, that her financial independence would be protected, that Daniel would have no claim to any of it, nor would he ever ask. And more importantly, they agreed on something else. It was time to move out of the Dawson-owned condo. Time to create a home that was truly theirs. A space where Barbara didn't hold a key, a life that wasn't monitored, measured, or manipulated. In choosing to be honest, Emily had risked everything. But Daniel chose her anyway. And in doing so, he proved that love wasn't about sharing everything, it was about respecting what the other person needed to feel safe. The decision to move out wasn't just about privacy, it was about power. A week after their conversation, Emily and Daniel signed a lease for a quiet apartment in a brownstone near the university. It wasn't as large as the condo, but it was theirs. No extra keys floating around. No surprise visits. No looming eyes. Barbara, unsurprisingly, did not take the news well. "You're moving?" she asked over dinner, her voice tight. "But the condo is perfectly fine. You'll be wasting money on rent when you already have a place." "We need our own space, Mom," Daniel said gently. "It's time." Barbara didn't argue, at least not out loud, but the coldness in her eyes told Emily everything. And then came the guilt trips. Barbara would call Daniel at odd hours with emotional updates. "Your father isn't sleeping. He's worried. We built that condo with our retirement in mind. If you two leave, what does that mean for our plans?" Then she began to reach out to Emily directly. "It's such a shame," she sighed over coffee one afternoon. "Families should support each other. I mean, you and Daniel are doing so well. Meanwhile, the business has been struggling." Emily said nothing. Barbara leaned in. "We could really use a bit of help. A short-term investment. Just something small. Surely you've got something tucked away from your grandmother, don't you?" There it was, the true reason behind the sudden closeness. Emily put down her cup. "I'm sorry, Barbara. My assets are not available for investment." Barbara's expression faltered. "You'd rather let your family suffer?" "No," Emily said firmly. "I'd rather protect what was entrusted to me." The weeks that followed were tense. At a family gathering, Emily overheard Barbara telling an aunt that she was disappointed in how ungrateful some people had become. But Emily didn't flinch. She had expected this. And Daniel, true to his word, stood by her. When Barbara called asking Daniel to intervene, he told her plainly, "This is Emily's decision, and I support it." That was the turning point. Barbara realized she couldn't manipulate her son the way she used to, that the marriage wasn't another extension of her influence. that Emily wasn't a pawn to be moved around. Emily had drawn a line, and Daniel at last had learned how to respect it. Their new home wasn't just a different address. It was a declaration, a quiet rebellion against control, and a commitment to build a life on their own terms, free, equal, and untouchable. For a while, things were calm. Emily and Daniel settled into their new home, their routines becoming peaceful again. Without Barbara's unannounced visits or subtle critiques, Emily felt her shoulders slowly relax in ways she hadn't realized were tense for so long. She decorated the apartment with quiet joy, choosing colors and furniture that reflected her, not anyone else's vision. Then, out of nowhere, came the emergency. Barbara had a heart attack. It was mild, but serious enough to warrant surgery and weeks of recovery. Daniel was shaken. Despite everything, she was still his mother. They rushed to the hospital, and Emily, without hesitation, stayed by his side. She helped fill out paperwork, brought meals, and even coordinated with doctors when Daniel was too overwhelmed to process information. She didn't do it for Barbara, she did it for him. After the surgery, Barbara was admitted to a rehabilitation facility. Her insurance covered most costs, but there was a significant gap for post-op care at home. Daniel's father, retired and confused by the situation, seemed ill-equipped to handle it alone. That's when the call came. Daniel stepped into the living room, phone still in hand. She asked if we could help. Financially. Emily looked at him. Did she say how much? He nodded. She wants to hire a full-time caregiver for 2 months. It would cost over $10,000. They don't have it. He didn't pressure her. He simply shared the information and waited. Emily thought about it for a long time. And then she quietly transferred the money. It wasn't out of obligation. It wasn't to win favor. It was because she knew deep down that power meant having a choice. And she chose to help, not because she was expected to, but because she was free to decide. Barbara never said thank you directly, but her tone changed. During rehab visits, her voice softened. The usual sharpness gave way to something slower, more reflective. I didn't realize, Barbara said one evening as Emily helped adjust her pillows. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Emily smiled. I've always been strong. You just never looked closely. There was a long pause. Your grandmother would be proud, Barbara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't need her approval, but those words still mattered. Because they weren't about money, or property, or control. They were an admission of something deeper, respect. That moment didn't erase the past, but it marked a shift. From adversaries to cautious understanding. From suspicion to reluctant admiration. Emily had stood her ground, protected what was hers, and in the end, gave from a place of strength, not submission. And perhaps, in doing so, she taught Barbara something no lecture ever could. That true generosity has nothing to do with wealth. And everything to do with choice. Months passed. Barbara's recovery continued steadily, and Emily and Daniel quietly returned to the rhythm of their lives. But something had changed, not just in their marriage, or in Barbara's tone, but in Emily herself. For the first time in years, she felt untethered. Free. One Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through their apartment window, Emily sat with a steaming cup of coffee and an open notebook. Daniel was still asleep, the house quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock. She stared at the page, thinking about what came next. The apartments her grandmother left were doing well. All 3 had stable tenants, solid leases, and had appreciated significantly in value. But for Emily, they weren't just investments, they were legacy, security, a reminder that women in her family had always survived by being smart, strategic, and quietly strong. She began drafting a plan. Not for more wealth, not for expansion, but for something of her own. A foundation, small and local, dedicated to helping women transition out of toxic environments. Not flashy, not corporate, just a network of support, temporary housing, legal resources, financial education. Emily knew how it felt to be cornered, to feel dependent, to stay silent for fear of losing everything.
What if she could help other women find their voice faster than she had? When she told Daniel about it later that week, he didn't blink. It sounds incredible, he said. Tell me how I can help. So she did. She registered the nonprofit quietly, naming it Louise's Key after her grandmother. The idea was simple: when the world locks you out or tries to lock you in, you need a key of your own. Emily poured her energy into it. On evenings and weekends, she met with social workers, lawyers, and volunteers. Her story, once hidden, became the reason others started to open up. One woman emailed after a workshop saying, "Your words reminded me that I'm not weak for walking away. I'm strong for choosing peace." And with every message, every meeting, every late night planning session, Emily realized something beautiful. She had turned a legacy of silence into a future of voice. One evening, she visited Madison Park, the building with the apartment that had once exposed her secret. She stood on the balcony looking out at the same skyline, but this time with clarity in her heart. She no longer had to hide. Her wealth wasn't in the apartments. It wasn't in her bank account. It was in the life she had chosen, the boundaries she had set, the love she had nurtured, the courage she had held on to when no one was watching, and the key that had once opened only doors now opened futures. The first anniversary of Louise's key arrived quietly, with no fanfare, just how Emily liked it. She sat in the small community room they'd recently renovated, surrounded by women sharing coffee, laughter, and stories that once might have been spoken in whispers. A woman named Carla, who had fled an emotionally abusive marriage, now taught basic budgeting classes for single mothers. Another, Nia, had just secured her first full-time job after months of struggling with housing instability. Emily looked around and felt something bloom in her chest. This wasn't charity. This was dignity. She thought about her grandmother often now, not with grief, but with a sense of kinship. Louise had never said much, but everything she did was deliberate, thoughtful, strategic. And it was that same quiet strength that Emily now carried woven into every decision she made. Meanwhile, Daniel had grown too. He no longer apologized for setting boundaries. He no longer allowed guilt to dictate his choices. When Barbara asked to move in temporarily during her second recovery phase, Daniel gently refused. "We'll help arrange care," he told her, "but we need our own space." Barbara didn't argue. Perhaps she finally understood that proximity wasn't the same as connection, and that love could exist with distance, and even with no. One night, as Emily closed up the office, she noticed a letter slipped under the door. It was handwritten in soft cursive. "Emily, you may never fully know what your strength has meant to others, but I see it now. I was wrong about you. Thank you for protecting what mattered, because it's allowed you to give so much more. Barbara." It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't even an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that's enough. Emily folded the letter and tucked it away, not because she needed to revisit it, but because it marked a moment. A quiet turning point in a life defined not by drama, but by resolve. When people asked how she did it, how she managed to build something powerful without losing herself, she simply said, "I stayed quiet until I was strong enough to speak. And then I only spoke when it mattered." Because revenge didn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it came through becoming everything they said you couldn't. Sometimes it came through peace, through boundaries, through building something no one could touch. And in doing that, Emily had transformed not just her story, but the lives of countless others. That was her legacy, not just what she inherited, but what she dared to create. In the end, Emily Dawson didn't win through shouting revenge or proving others wrong. She won by protecting her truth quietly. She won by waiting, watching, and choosing exactly when and how to speak. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't to tear others down. It was to build something stronger. She didn't need Barbara's approval. She didn't need anyone to see her as noble, forgiving, or selfless. She wasn't any of those things all the time. She had moments of fear, of doubt, of temptation to walk away from everything. But she stayed. And not for tradition, not for appearances, for the future. Because in a world where some people use love as leverage and kindness as currency, Emily learned that the most radical thing she could do was protect her own story on her terms. No signatures, no explanations, no compromises. Just a woman with her own keys, her own name, her own life. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt silenced by family, by expectations, by fear, let Emily's story remind you, you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to prove your worth to people who never intended to see it. And you don't owe your peace to anyone who benefits from your silence. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't loud. It's leaving them confused by your calm. It's building a life so full and untouchable they can't rewrite your story even if they try. So share and comment if this story spoke to something inside you. Because maybe your silence isn't weakness. Maybe it's power. waiting for the right moment to rise.